Let me be very clear about something. Honestly, the firefight in and around Hormuz was not some sideshow, and it was not a little footnote to a diplomatic process. It was the shock that flipped the whole frame. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand something that the mainstream conversation is completely missing. What looked, on television, like a boxed-in exchange of fire was actually a stress test on the most strategically sensitive corridor on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz is not just water. It is the choke point through which roughly a fifth of global oil trade moves, plus a decisive share of liquefied natural gas and the shipping lanes that turn regional tension into global price action within hours. That is why a localized clash there matters more than the headline number of missiles, more than the number of ships involved, more than the language used in the ceasefire statement. In Hormuz, the battlefield effect is the message. Actually, the official story always tries to split combat from consequence. It says a ceasefire is a diplomatic endpoint, a line that can be drawn on a map and then enforced by will. The data shows something very different. Well, a ceasefire only exists on paper until the ships stop maneuvering, the aircraft stop shadowing, the coastal batteries stop being moved, and every commander in the chain believes the other side believes the silence will be punished if broken. That is not peace. That is an operational pause. And in a corridor as narrow and as vulnerable as Hormuz, an operational pause is never neutral. It is a contest over who blinks first. So basically, this is why the firefight mattered more than the statement that followed it. Once shots are exchanged in that zone, Washington is pushed into a defensive posture, whether it admits it or not. The United States can still deploy destroyers, reposition carrier strike groups, fly ISAR platforms, and surge missile defense assets into the Gulf. It still has a massive military footprint across Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, Kuwait, and the wider theater. But power is not the same as control. Power says you can respond. Control says the other side has already adjusted its behavior because of your response. Hormuz is where that difference becomes visible. Honestly, the arithmetic is brutal. A single corridor can be watched by multiple task forces, but it cannot be made invulnerable. There are too many small boats, too many coastal launch points, too many layered threats, too many commercial hulls to screen, too many minutes in which a radar picture becomes a market event. One tanker delayed, one escort forced to change course, one anti-ship system activated, and the price signal ripples far beyond the Gulf. That is how a localized clash becomes a global story. Not because the exchange itself is large, but because the corridor amplifies every risk. Ceasefire declarations do not change that geometry. They merely create a political expectation that someone somewhere can guarantee compliance. Washington can threaten sanctions, maritime interdiction, precision strikes, and expanded naval presence. It can also signal de-escalation through back channels and public restraint. But every one of those tools has a ceiling. Sanctions do not stop a fast patrol craft. Naval power does not erase geography. Air defense does not make shipping psychologically secure. And political signaling only works if the other side believes the costs of testing the ceasefire are higher than the gains of demonstrating that it is fragile. That is the Iranian calculation, not irrationality. Calculation. Tehran understands that Hormuz is not merely a battlefield. It is leverage that lives in the gap between military capacity and commercial confidence. It does not need to close the strait to create pressure. It only needs to prove that closure is plausible, that harassment is possible, that escalation can be made expensive without becoming all-out war. That is enough to force insurance premiums upward, reroute some shipping, complicate energy planning, and remind every regional capital that the American security umbrella is real but not unlimited. The regional aftershocks are immediate. The Gulf monarchies do not read a ceasefire as reassurance. They read it as a reminder that their ports, export terminals, desalination infrastructure, and shipping lifelines sit inside a threat envelope that can be activated quickly and with little warning. Markets read it the same way. Traders do not wait for formal war. They react to instability, to ambiguity, to the possibility that the next exchange is not symbolic but systemic. That is why one firefight near Hormuz can move freight rates, insurance costs, and commodity expectations before a single official briefing is finished. And here is the larger lesson. American power in the Gulf now depends less on escalation than on whether it can still command compliance without revealing weakness. If Washington overreacts, it confirms that local actors can drag the United States into the posture they choose. If Washington underreacts, it signals that its deterrent language is thinner than its military presence. That is the trap. The gun is loaded, but the question is whether anyone in a position of authority has the strategic clarity to set it back down without looking like they were forced to do so. That is why the ceasefire itself matters less than the machinery behind it. Once the guns go quiet, the harder question begins. Who actually has the ability to make the silence hold? What looked like a contained clash actually redrew the map of leverage. The real test is no longer who fired first, but who can keep the truce from becoming a paper promise. In the waters around Hormuz, that distinction matters more than almost anything else, because the battlefield effect is not just measured in ships hit or missiles launched. It is measured in whether commercial traffic resumes with confidence, whether insurers believe the lanes are stable, and whether both sides stop preparing for the next exchange while publicly pretending the matter is settled. A ceasefire is not enforcement. That is the central problem. Washington can announce a cessation of hostilities with a straight face and call it de-escalation. Tehran can accept the same language and call it tactical prudence. Both can say yes. Neither has to believe the other. And unless there is a mechanism that makes violation costly in real time, both sides keep their options open. That is the asymmetry. The agreement exists on paper, but the operational reality is that each side is still positioning for the next round. In the Gulf, that gap becomes visible immediately. Tankers do not move on political slogans. They move when captains, insurers, port authorities, and naval escorts believe the route is usable. A ceasefire does not restore that belief by itself. What restores it is repeated proof that attacks will be intercepted, sanctions will be enforced, and retaliation will follow any breach fast enough to matter. Without that, the truce is only a pause in the cycle. The shipping firms understand this before the diplomats do. So do the traders. So do the commanders on both sides who are counting missile inventory, drone launch capacity, and the hours it would take to reopen a corridor for harassment. Washington often confuses declaration with control. That is the recurring error. The public statement becomes the substitute for the operational condition. A ceasefire is announced, and the assumption follows that the problem has been managed. But control is not speech. Control is a system of penalties, channels, and credible follow-through. It requires a visible cost for cheating, a reliable line of communication to prevent miscalculation, and the willingness to impose consequences even when doing so creates short-term friction. If those elements are missing, the ceasefire is not enforced, it is merely narrated. That is where American power still matters, but in a narrower and more expensive way than before. Washington still has tools. It can surge naval presence. It can tighten interdiction. It can expand intelligence, sharing with Gulf partners. It can use sanctions, designation packages, and secondary pressure on financial and logistical nodes. It can make clear that attacks on shipping or infrastructure will not be absorbed as background noise. But every one of those tools now comes with a cost that is harder to hide than before. More ships in the water signal resolve, but they also signal vulnerability. More sanctions signal leverage, but they also remind everyone that leverage must be constantly renewed. More public threats can deter, but they can also expose the fact that deterrence was not complete. Iran reads that environment differently. Tehran does not need to believe that a ceasefire is permanent. It only needs to believe that the pause improves its position. That is the classic asymmetric compliance problem. On paper, both sides may accept the same formula. In practice, one side uses the lull to restore readiness, reposition assets, test thresholds, and preserve the option to resume pressure under a lower diplomatic cost. The other side wants the lull to become a stable end state, but does not always have the enforcement architecture to make that happen. So the truce becomes a breathing space, not a settlement. The markets understand this instinctively. Freight rates, insurance premiums, and regional risk spreads respond not to the signature on the ceasefire, but to whether the next incident is credible. A few quiet days can ease panic. They do not erase the price of uncertainty. Every trader knows that one drone, one mine, one intercepted launch, one damaged hull can reverse sentiment in an hour. That is why the aftershock from a ceasefire is often not relief, but a tense recalibration. Everyone is waiting to see whether compliance is real or merely temporary, and that is the larger lesson here. American power in the Gulf now depends less on escalation than on whether it can still command compliance without revealing weakness. That is a harder task than it sounds. Escalation is visible, compliance is subtle, it is built through restraint backed by the credible ability to punish. If Washington cannot make the cost of violation unmistakable, then the ceasefire will hold only as long as both sides decide it suits them. The signature matters less than the machinery behind it. The real question is not whether the war has paused. The real question is whether anyone can enforce the pause. So the focus shifts from the signature on the agreement to the instruments behind it. Washington still has tools, but each one now comes with a cost that is harder to hide than before. A ceasefire without enforcement is only a timeout, and timeouts favor the side that can absorb pressure, confuse observers, and keep options open. That is the reality around Hormuz now. The battlefield effect is not just the ships in the channel or the missiles overhead, it is the sudden recognition that a declaration does not move tankers, reopen routes, or restore confidence unless someone is willing to make compliance real. That is where the gap begins. Washington can declare a ceasefire, can call for restraint, can announce that escalation is over. None of that, by itself, changes the operating environment in the Strait of Hormuz. Enforcement is the hard part because enforcement means more than rhetoric. It means sanctions that actually bite, naval presence that actually deters, air power that actually threatens, intelligence sharing that actually tightens the net, alliance coordination that actually holds under stress, and financial pressure that actually raises the cost of defiance. On paper, the toolkit looks large. In practice, each lever is weaker than it appears. Sanctions can still hurt, but the market has learned how to round them, how to disguise flows, how to build parallel channels, how to wait out political cycles in Washington. Naval presence matters, but a carrier strike group is not some magic wand. It is a visible asset, which means it is also a visible target. And every extra mile it sails into the Gulf increases the risk of a miscalculation that nobody can easily contain. Air power can strike, but every strike creates a question that does not disappear after the first explosion. What is the response threshold? What is the exit path? And who owns the escalation ladder once the first round lands? Intelligence sharing can sharpen awareness, but awareness is not enforcement. It tells you what is happening. It does not automatically give you the authority or the willingness to stop it. The political problem is worse than the military one. Every move Washington makes is now judged through three filters at once. Can it work? Can it be sustained? And can it be defended at home if it fails? A sanction package that does not change behavior becomes a signal of impotence. A naval deployment that does not restore passage becomes a billboard advertising caution. A strike that does not produce submission can harden the very resistance it was meant to break. That is the trap. Power is not the same as discipline. The United States can still project force in the Gulf, but projecting force and converting that force into compliance are not the same function. Iran understands this. Tehran does not need to believe it can defeat the United States in a direct conventional fight. It only needs to believe that Washington's coercive tools are expensive to use, politically fragile, and vulnerable to partial failure. That is enough to shape behavior. If the response to pressure is calibrated, deniable, and persistent, then the burden shifts to Washington to decide how much disruption it can tolerate before escalation becomes self-defeating. This is why enforcement after Hormuz is not about raw power alone. It is about whether the United States can turn power into discipline without dragging the region into a wider confrontation that it cannot control on favorable terms. The regional aftershocks move immediately through insurance rates, freight premiums, energy prices, and alliance confidence. Every hour of uncertainty adds cost. Every convoy rerouted adds leverage to the actors who can keep the pressure alive. And every public statement from Washington is now measured against one simple test. Does it change the behavior on the water, or does it merely change the language in the briefing room? That test is brutal because markets do not trade in intentions. They trade in risk. Regional capitals do not plan around slogans. They plan around demonstrated resolve. That is the larger lesson. American power in the Gulf now depends less on escalation than on whether it can still command compliance without exposing the limits of its own coercion. The appearance of strength is no longer enough. If the move fails, the credibility cost is immediate. If the move succeeds only by opening a broader conflict, the strategic cost may be even worse. That narrowing room is exactly what Tehran studies. The next layer is not American capability in the abstract, but Iranian judgment about how far Washington will actually go. The battlefield effect around Hormuz was immediate. Once the firefight made clear that American power was still present but not unlimited, Tehran began reading the signal the way it always does, not as a slogan, but as a test of thresholds, inconsistency, and fatigue. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand something the public debate keeps missing. Washington can declare a ceasefire in a single sentence. It cannot enforce one with a sentence. That gap is where Iranian strategy lies. The declaration creates a political frame. The enforcement problem creates a military one. If the United States threatens loudly but moves carefully, if it answers provocations but avoids a broader strike, if it talks about red lines while keeping its own exposure low, then Tehran does not hear resolve in the abstract. It hears a ceiling. That is the critical distinction. Iran does not need to believe it can defeat the United States in open battle. It needs to believe Washington is selecting limited options because it is managing escalation, not because it has eliminated it. The moment Iran concludes that the ceasefire can be bent without being broken, enforcement becomes harder than retaliation. Retaliation is a moment. Enforcement is a pattern. Patterns require repetition, consistency, and the willingness to pay costs that are visible to everyone watching. The American toolkit is still real. Carrier presence matters. Air and missile defense matter. ISR coverage matters. Sanctions still matter at the margins. So does interdiction. So does maritime coordination with partners. So does the ability to shift force posture quickly enough to complicate Iranian planning. But each of those tools has a psychological dimension attached to it. They only deter if Iran believes they will be used in a way that is both prompt and sustained. If the response is precise but limited, Tehran does not automatically read that as strength. It may read it as compartmentalization. That is why the Iranian internal logic is built around patience, deniability, and calibrated pressure. Patience means waiting for the other side to reveal its true threshold. Deniability means keeping pressure below the level that justifies an immediate full response. Calibrated pressure means applying just enough friction to test resolve while staying inside a zone where escalation can still be managed. This is not improvisation. It is institutional memory. Tehran has spent years learning how to operate under a ceiling of retaliation that is threatening in theory but uneven in practice. After the firefight, every signal from Washington is scrutinized for contradiction. A public threat paired with a narrow strike package. A warning about consequences paired with an effort to avoid civilian spillover. An insistence that the ceasefire stands alongside language that suggests the United States is trying to get out of the cycle rather than dominate it. Iran watches for all of it. It looks for the mismatch between declared intent and operational appetite. That mismatch is not a side issue. It is the core of deterrence psychology. Most people miss the arithmetic because they think deterrence is about punishment alone. It is not. It is about convincing the other side that the cost of probing is higher than the benefit of testing. If the adversary sees hesitation, it does not need to win. It only needs to normalize small violations. A launch here, a proxy move there, a shipping incident that falls just below the threshold for major escalation. Each incident is a probe. Each probe is a data point. Tehran does not have to break the ceasefire on day one. It only has to discover how much strain the ceasefire can absorb before Washington chooses to stop paying for enforcement. That is where the regional and market aftershocks begin to matter. Shipping insurers, tanker operators, port authorities, energy traders, and allied governments all read the same pattern in different languages. The market does not wait for a formal breakdown. It prices uncertainty the moment enforcement appears selective. If a ceasefire is declared, but the sea lanes remain under pressure, the premium rises. If the United States appears determined but cautious, the premium rises differently, but it still rises. The result is the same. Every actor along the chain starts adjusting to the possibility that the boundary is porous, and that, in turn, feeds back into Iranian thinking. If Tehran sees markets absorbing friction without a decisive American response, it concludes that the burden of proof has shifted. Washington now has to prove that its warnings mean something. That is a harder task than striking back once. It requires discipline across the entire policy chain. It requires no theatrical threats that cannot be sustained. It requires no public overreach that would force a reversal. It requires the United States to command compliance without exposing weakness. That is the larger lesson. American power in the Gulf no longer depends primarily on the ability to escalate. Everyone assumes escalation is available. The question is whether Washington can still use its leverage in a way that compels behavior without advertising doubt. Iran is looking for the point where pressure becomes habit and habit becomes restraint. If it finds that point, it will press against it, not in a way that announces a rupture, in a way that measures whether the ceasefire is real or only spoken, and that test does not stay between two capitals. The entire Gulf, from shipping routes to energy markets to allied capitals, immediately feels the strain. What happens next will be read everywhere as a measure of whether the United States still commands compliance, or only the appearance of it. If Tehran believes Washington wants quiet more than control, then every pause becomes a test of how much pressure the United States can still carry. And once the corridor around Hormuz starts to look unstable, the issue is no longer only missiles, drones, or intercepts. It becomes a regional audit of American credibility. The battlefield effect is immediate.